So, when I first saw Togedemaru, I was actually very worried about how he would turn out in the metagame, because we can look at Pokemon like Pachirisu, or Pachirisu, however you prefer to say it. We look at Pokemon like Emolga, we can look at Minun and Plusle. Pretty much every new Pikachu of each generation has problems in the meta because they're simply not strong enough. They don't get evolutions, and their stats usually don't stack up to the competition. However, I think Togedemaru has a few unique traits, along with a new topping in Electric Steel. Not new because Magneton had it, but new in the sense that the Pikachu clones has received it. I think that a mixture of that, his abilities, and his moves that he has the ability to use could actually make him very viable and actually fairly versatile. So, first of all, we'll get into his stats, and they really don't look very good. His HP is below average, his defenses are also fairly low, he's pretty frail for a fully evolved Pokemon, and especially since because of that, he does not get access to Eevee a lot. His attack is alright at base 98. It's a little under average for a physical attacker, but it's still usable, especially since his special attack is only 40. You don't really have an option. And his speed at 96 isn't bad by any means, especially for this generation. But it simply does not surpass the very crowded base 100 speed tier that is going to be very important once OU Pokebank becomes standard. Once Pokebank is opened up and people can transfer any Pokemon from Gen 6 over to Gen 7, then he'll be seeing a lot of problems. He'll be getting outsped by a lot of Pokemon that are very commonly used. Now, if we look at his abilities, he actually gets 3 abilities that are very commonly seen on other Pokemon. The first one is Iron Barbs, which really I don't think he's the best at using, but I also don't think it's the worst ability in the world for him, because even though he's fairly frail, he gets some moves that can help him with his physical defense, and being able to do 1/8 of his opponent's maximum HP and damage if they hit him with a contact move is actually pretty useful if you can, say, catch a Pokemon while it's U-turning, or catch an Iron Head from some Steel type. And that way, even if you have no defensive investment, you're still going to take very minimal damage from an attack that you 4 times resist. And he also gets Lightning Rod, which in singles is probably not very useful at all, because he already resists the electric typing, and so giving him an immunity and giving him a special attack boost really doesn't matter very much in the grand scheme of things. However, in doubles, if you were to be running teams that were otherwise very weak to electric type moves, this could be very handy because he could soak up those moves, and even though he couldn't use his boost, he could at least prevent them from hitting his partners. The last move he gets is Sturdy, which means that as long as he is at full health, he cannot get one shot. He cannot get knocked out in one hit. And while it is a handy ability if you switch in at full health and your opponent reads you and hits you with an Earthquake, I'm not sure how viable it could be in a meta that's so full of hazards, and in a way where he'll probably have some prior damage on him for some reason before he almost gets one shot. So I think most of the time I would prefer Iron Barbs on this Pokemon, not because they're the best on him, but as far as situations go, I think they'll more commonly be able to do damage to your opponent, and eventually that could cause, say, something U-turns out, and the extra Iron Barbs damage could mean they couldn't switch in on hazards again, or it could break their Focus Sash, and it has some different utility to it. So, Togedemaru's typing is actually the best defensive typing in the game when we're talking about resistances. He only takes normal or super effective damage from 6 types. That is 1/3 of all the types in the game. That means he resists 2/3 of the typings in the game, which is pretty crazy. He's very good at taking hits, as long as they're not super effective. So his only weaknesses are fire, fighting, and he has a double weakness, a 4 times weakness to ground type moves. That means that most mud shots or mud slaps or any kind of ground move is going to knock this thing out. There's just no question about it. He's also not going to want to take fire fighting type hits, but other than these 3 typings, he only takes normal damage from ghost, dark, and water. He resists or is immune to every other typing. That is absolutely crazy, because with a lot of Pokemon, when you run coverage, you may not have one of these 6 types. Now, ground is a common type to carry, but other than that, if your Pokemon that's your sweeper doesn't get access to a ground type move, or a fighting type move, or even a water type move, then you may have a lot of trouble taking down Togedemarus that have some investment in their bulk, even though they're not very bulky. And my perfect plan for this Pokemon that I've thought of, before we get into the specific sets, this Pokemon would be such a good partner for Golisopod. And hear me out on this. Golisopod, as you know, has an attack called First Impression. It is a 90 base power move, bug type, so he gets stabbed from it. Very, very strong move, but it only works on turn 1. So say you lead with the Golisopod, use your First Impression, do your damage, whatever, and then your opponent switches in to the appropriate Pokemon to either take the hit or deal some damage to you. Togedemaru and Golisopod do really, really well at covering each other's weaknesses. In fact, the only move that neither of them resist is fire, which Togedemaru is weak to, and Golisopod takes neutral damage from. Other than that, one of them will resist, or they both take neutral. Neither of them is weak to it. So this is very, very important, because Golisopod is so based on switching constantly, whether you choose to or you let your opponent knock you down to a level where you can use emergency exit. And so having a Togedemaru that can pivot out with things like U-turn and can use some of the moves that we're about to cover could be very, very useful. I think these two are going to be very good partners in the future. So the first set I had was more of an offensive set, just because his stats pointed so strongly toward running him offensively. So for this set, I decided to throw on a Life Orb to get more damage out of that decent attack stat, a Jolly Nature with max attack and max speed, and his moves really aren't the best. He gets Fell Stinger, which got buffed in this generation. If you don't know what it does, it is now a 50 base power bug type move, but if you were to pick up a kill with it, it gives you +3 attack. So that's equal to a Tail Glow, but with physical attack. So if you were able to switch in on a Pokemon that was very weakened and they just decided to use it as death fodder, if you were to hit that with a Fell Stinger, suddenly you are a force to be reckoned with. You are very, very strong, because +3 at the 98 base attack is a very good place to be. It's very hard to switch in on that. However, it's a little unfortunate that his coverage isn't better. Past the Fell Stinger, you need Stab in either Zing Zap, which I believe is unique to this Pokemon, or in Wild Charge. So Zing Zap is similar to Iron Head. It is 80 base power and it may flinch the target. But Wild Charge, while slightly more powerful at 90 base power, causes recoil. So it's really what you prefer. I really think I would be running Wild Charge, just because this Pokemon, especially if you do not get the Fell Stinger boost, needs as much power as possible. And running Wild Charge over Zing Zap might mean the difference in a knockout and your opponent living on red and knocking you out in return. After this, Poison Jab is the next logical move, because it's good for fairy coverage. And if you're wondering why I decided to put Poison Jab over Iron Head or any kind of steel type coverage that this Pokemon would get that would handle fairies and give him a stab boost, he only gets one steel type physical move, and it is Gyro Ball. If you all aren't aware, Gyro Ball is stronger the slower you are than your opponent. So let's remind ourselves, what was his speed stat? Base 96. Gyro Ball is a terrible move for this Pokemon. It will never be doing a lot of damage unless your opponent is running a max speed Deoxys speed form with 0 defense IVs, he is not going to be doing much damage. So instead of steel type coverage, I thought Poison Jab would work well enough. And then for the last move, you really don't have much more coverage. So the next best things are either Magnet Rise, so that you can dodge electric type moves for 5 turns, which could be very handy, especially if you read your opponent and there's something like Choice Banded into Earthquake, and suddenly they can't touch you for 5 turns. That could give you a chance to set up your Fell Stinger or to do some damage on whatever switches in. But if you decided not to run that, Return is always a basic option for handling things that would resist all of your moves otherwise. So things like Rock Ground types would resist most of your moves, and Pokemon like that. Pokemon you have trouble breaking through, sometimes Return can help. Not specifically with the Rock Ground types, but with other types that might wall you. So other moves he actually gets a lot of moves that are useful in doubles, such as Fake Out, Encore, and Spiky Shield. So Fake Out, as you know, flinches your opponent, so that could be handy for breaking sashes, outspeeding things, and picking up knockouts on very weakened Pokemon. You can run Encore to, say you Magnet Rise on your opponent's Earthquake. If they decide they're going to switch their attack and hit you with something else, you can Encore them, and as long as you're faster, that means they're suddenly trapped into Earthquake, and you're in a very, very good situation against them. You can also run Wish, which is kind of odd on this Pokemon. I believe it's an egg move, but it grants you 50% of your health back in the following turn. So if you run Wish and Spiky Shield together, Spiky Shield is Protect, but if your opponent attacks you, it actually hurts them if they make contact. So this could also be a very powerful pair of moves on him. He also learns Fling, which means that you could throw items and do damage to your opponent. You could flinch them with King's Rocks. You could deal a lot of damage with an Iron Ball if you decided to run that for whatever reason, but it's more for less common sets and maybe things to surprise your opponent. I really don't see it getting used very much, but he does not get a lot at all in the way of physical coverage. He also gets U-Turn, which, as I mentioned earlier, it's really good for pivoting. I think he would be an absolutely amazing partner with Golisopod. He gets Reflect, so that could help his otherwise frailness in his physical side, and you could run a fully specially defensive one and keep Reflect on him. And then he gets Thunder Wave and Nuzzle. And this is interesting because at first I thought, well, you could run them fairly interchangeably, and then I remembered Thunder Wave was actually nerfed in this generation, and if you didn't know, Thunder Wave's accuracy was dropped from 100% chance to 90%. So really, it's always better to run Nuzzle, because you'll be doing damage to your opponent. It's only 20 base power, but I mean, like I said, you'll be breaking sashes, or getting a little bit of damage on anything. You never know when that extra 1 hit point might come in handy. And you also still get the 100% paralysis chance. So Nuzzle is better in every way than to Thunder Wave. So the next set I had was a bulky support Togedemaru. And we're using most of the moves I mentioned because his move pool really isn't that diverse. I would run Leftovers, max out his defenses as best I can, and run an extra 4 speed so that he can outpace other, say, Togedemarus or other Pokemon that are much slower than him that might be running max speed otherwise. You never know when the extra speed may come in handy. Otherwise, you can stick that in special defense or even attack. And from here, I thought the best moves to run would be Spiky Shield, because I don't know how many people realize that Togedemaru gets Spiky Shield, and so it would be a good surprise to catch physical attackers off guard. From there, you'd need a statusing move, Toxic for damage, Nuzzle to slow down your opponents. Either or would work. Then I think the utility of being able to switch out and gain momentum is always very important. So U-Turn is obviously the better choice, and for that you'd run an Impish Nature, just so that you would lower your special attack instead of your physical attack. You could run Volt Switch if you'd prefer, but even with Stab, I don't think it's hardly ever doing more damage than U-Turn would, and really it's more for momentum than damage anyway. And the last move, you could run Wish, you could run Electric Coverage, probably Zing Zap, so that if you, say, ran Nuzzle, you could then run Zing Zap and Paraflinch your opponent, and as annoying as that can be, it's really a decent strategy when you don't have a good way around a Pokemon otherwise. And the last set I had was a choice set. You could run either Choice Band or Choice Scarf. If you ran a Choice Band set, I would say Jolly would be the better nature. That way you could max out your speed and have the band to boost your attack. If you ran Choice Scarf, you could more safely run an Adamant nature because you'd have more than enough speed, so then you'd need more damage. You max out your attack and speed yet again, and then you'd need more coverage. So the main three moves are either Wild Charge or Zing Zap. I think for the Choice Scarf set, Zing Zap would be better because you'd more likely flinch your opponent, and you never know when that may come in handy. And for the Choice Band set, probably either or, but I would probably prefer Wild Charge just because Choice Band is usually made to damage your opponent as much as possible. U-turn, obviously, for momentum. You run Poison Jab for the coverage I mentioned earlier, and then your last move is really difficult choice because Fell Stinger is really not good if you can't switch your move, because even at +3 attack, a resisted Fell Stinger is not doing a lot of damage, and you won't be able to switch up your move because you're choiced into it. Reversal is alright, but it's really low base power unless you take damage first, and if you're not running bulk, then you're frail, so you may not be able to. Thief is an alright dark type coverage move, but I really don't see this Pokemon getting knocked off often, so the secondary effect of Thief wouldn't be very important. And then Facade, if you were to get burned, you would still have a semi-powerful move because the base power would be doubled. So overall, I thought this Pokemon at first would be very, very inferior in the meta, but the more I look at it, the more I think that it's actually fairly viable.